So, truth goes hand in hand with fact. A truth is a true proposition, which is a kind of claim about, and you can use very mundane examples, snow is white. Of course, even the most mundane examples harbor lots of complexities because white is a color, and a question about kind of properties colors are, and so on and so forth. But basically, a truth is a true proposition, and what we think is when there's a truth proposition, then there is a fact that corresponds to that true proposition. It doesn't have to be a very heavy-duty notion of correspond. So what some people believe is that no fact simply sits out there, irrespective of human beings or human minds or human intervention or something like that. That a fact, which is basically when an object has a certain property, is always in some way constructed by human activity, mental activity. In particular, I guess they think, it has to be categorized as that by a human mind, otherwise it wouldn't be a fact. Now, the thing about this that should strike one off the bat as peculiar is that we tend to think that human beings came onto the scene quite late. So there were things that existed before human beings existed. And that sets up a puzzle about how human beings could have constructed all the facts, when some of the facts presumably antedated the arrival of human beings. So, of course, there are answers that the constructivist can give to that, and they're neither very satisfactory nor very intuitive, because we have to say, well, we can construct our own past. Okay. But given that we're now already very close to saying things that are hard to understand, the real question is, what's the motivation? Why do people want to say something as counterintuitive as that all facts are constructed by human mental activity? And so there you enter into a kind of quest for diagnosis. What drove people to say this? And there are many different streams that contribute to this. But one of them that you see a lot in contemporary thinking, which really drives me crazy, is that it's a conflation of the notion of what is widely accepted to be a fact with what is a fact. And the reason people make this conflation is that they think, well, if somebody says that something is a fact, nobody has, they think, access to the facts. I mean, if people are disputing whether something is a fact, there is the fact that, as it were, one person believes it's a fact and the other person doesn't believe it. And then one person, the person who believes that it's a fact, might be supported by a whole bunch of other people, all of whom also believe that it's a fact. And so it becomes a widely accepted fact. And when those kinds of situations, they can bully the person who doesn't believe it's a fact, or they can outnumber them, or they can outlive them, or they can whatever. They will somehow prevail. And so what really matters is whether something is widely accepted to be a fact. How could it matter whether it is or is not a fact? And so through that process and maybe a few other steps, you begin to eliminate the notion of something's being a fact, and you replace it with the notion of something's being accepted to be a fact. Now, this notion of being accepted, widely accepted or taken for granted to be a fact, is a socially constructed notion. You see, that is because it's a fact about societies, whether or not they accept something to be a fact.
Could you give examples of either?
Yes, so, of course, something that's widely accepted to be a fact is that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around, which is what people used to think. Or if you like, that the Earth is spherical, not flat, which is what a long time ago, before the Greeks, people used to think. Well, I mean, quite an understandable view. When you look around, it looks kind of flat, except for the bumpiness.
So is that an agreed
an
an agreement about,
widely accepted to be a fact.
rather than a fact in itself.
Well, so what I'm saying is that what people sometimes get themselves into a frame of mind of thinking is we don't need the notion of a fact. What we need is just the notion of a widely accepted to be a fact, because that's really what matters. They're mistaken in this, but that's, I think, part of the motivation. They just think whether something is or is not a fact drops out as irrelevant. What really matters socially, what really matters in the argument is whether something is widely accepted to be a fact. And you can see this in the way in which even journalists talk like this, you know. So they will say things like, is evolution a fact or just an opinion or just a theory? That's the contrast. Is it a fact or is it just a theory? Where they mean, is this something that people are toying around with, or is it widely accepted? But that's a terrible, that is a misguided way of thinking about things, because what you're aiming at when you aim to discover whether to accept something as a fact and then whether to make it to be a widely accepted fact is whether it is a fact. So, you know, what people were trying to figure out is, what is the shape of the Earth? Yes, they used to believe it's flat, let's say, and then people thought, well, there's some very interesting astronomical data that can't be accounted for if you think that it's just some disk. Right? After all, for instance, you know, things seem to dip over the horizon as you walk towards them one direction or another. And so, you know, actually the evidence seems to suggest that it's spherical, which is surprising and a magnificent achievement of human reason to have figured that out on the basis of very spare information. But what they were trying to do is figure out what the facts are. They weren't trying to figure out what the widely accepted facts are. We know what the widely accepted facts are. In fact, one of the things that went on in that case is that you replaced one widely accepted fact with another, because you discovered that what was widely accepted to be a fact wasn't a fact. You cannot make sense of that distinction if you collapse the distinction between fact and widely accepted to be a fact.
I guess a lot of the thinkers who argue that there isn't actually, you know, kind of an objective reality out there would bring as examples the way in which the different species see reality, and to some extent they would argue that actually, you know, we humans might see the colors that we see in one way, and that's like a widely accepted fact for us, but actually that's not an objective, it's not a reflection of objective reality.
Right.
Well, what's your view on that?
Well, so, you know, so my view about colors is that, in fact, they're not real. Now, this is an unusual view. It was actually the view of the 17th century. So, you know, what happened was that people, when they discovered how to do physics in a very effective way, what they thought, well, physics, you know, the physical properties that we can work with are basically mass, extension, you know, geometrical and other physical properties. But colors, smells, sounds, all of that is really just in the mind. It's the way the mind responds to physical properties. It's not really out there, not really out there. That was Galileo's view and the view of the British empiricists. And I think there is something to that. It's really a slightly specialist kind of dispute, because you can actually reconcile my view with the view of people who think that colors are real, because what they really think is that colors are real in the sense that they are dispositions to cause certain kinds of sensation in us. So they don't really mean the thing that would be a direct clash with what I believe. So never mind all of that. There is no doubt, first, two things. One of them is that with regard to certain properties, they can look like they inhere in nature when they're really just reactions within the mind itself. Absolutely no problem with that. The second is that there is no doubt that there could be other sentient beings, such as animals, such as aliens with a different physiochemistry and a different way of interacting with the world, different sensorium, who would see things differently. None of this poses a problem for objectivity. Why? Because as long as they are consistent with one another, they can all be true together. Okay? This is one of the things that people sometimes don't understand about the issue of relativism. Relativism only becomes an issue when you have two descriptions of the world that are incompatible with one another, but both of which are said to be valid or true. That's relativism. Now, if I have a certain sensorium and I give you a description of the world that's correct, and then somebody else sees it in, I don't know, a different part of the spectrum and gives you a different description, but nevertheless consistent with mine, that's not an issue for it's not an issue for objectivity.
And what about the conflicting
Yes.
narrative? So, for instance, I guess dreams or sensations people have when they have psychedelic drugs or something like that, because that obviously gives individuals very different experiences from other human beings. How do they fit into an objective understanding of reality?
Well, I mean, I take it you'd have to say a bit more. You can have psychedelic experiences that, of course, distort reality. I mean, if they make this metal rod look like it's kind of fluctuating, then that could be an interesting experience and might teach you a few things, but it wouldn't be accurate, wouldn't be correct. Then, of course, there might be things that it reveals that are completely consistent with things that you already know, and they're just being revealed to you by that experience. That's also great and good. But as I say, the issue of, is there a single reality to which all of our thought is responsive or responsible, is only joined if you think that there are two descriptions of reality incompatible with one another that are both true.
Okay, so in these cases, we have an understanding of dreaming, for instance, or of what a drug does to our brain, and we can have like an objectivist understanding of the world and fit these different experiences within that framework. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we do, don't we?
Yeah, and then in terms of like...
I mean, you don't take the dreams to be true. If you're being chased by a tiger in your dreams, well, it can feel very real to you, but presumably it's not real. So what you can't do is say, I was both lying in bed and I was being chased by a tiger. Now, you people can describe themselves in that way as long as everybody understands what's being said, which is, I was lying in my bed, I was asleep, and I dreamt I was being chased by a tiger. It felt very real to me, so real that I couldn't believe I was just dreaming. And when I woke up, I was in a terrible sweat.
Yeah, exactly. So it is this feeling of reality, right, that is so disturbing, that it makes you doubt.
Yes. No, there is a feeling of reality. There is that, absolutely. And you can sometimes have it when it's not real, as in dreams or psychedelic experiences. Now, the relevance of that is not so much to the question of truth and relativism, but it is to the question of knowledge, how we know what is true, how we know what is a fact. Because if you can have this feeling of reality when in fact it's misleading, you can get into the standard classical skeptical problem of, how do I know that that's not happening right now? I have this strong feeling of reality, things seem very consistent, I seem to be sitting here talking to you, but maybe that's not real, right? So the classical skepticism is not, is a real problem, it's not dismissible. It doesn't raise any question about relativism doesn't raise any question about truth. In fact, presupposes that there is truth and it's objective, and the question is how we know what it is. You get much worse skeptical. The more of an objectivist you are about truth, the more skepticism you will have to deal with.
So how skeptical are you?
Well, I'm not very skeptical in the sense that, as Hume said, it's very hard actually to be a radical skeptic, in ordinary life. And, it also is true, although it would be hard to explain all of this properly, that, we aren't really aware of dreams with the level of coherence and consistency and detail over time that so-called ordinary waking experience seems to have. And we certainly believe that we can tell that distinction. Though I don't dismiss the problem. I think it's a problem for philosophers to solve. But it's not something that poses a practical difficulty day by day.
And to end the interview, I was just wondering if I could ask you one or two more general questions. One is, what is an idea you've changed your mind about recently?
It's a good one because there is, in fact, if you look at the literature, I said I've just finished a book on the a priori, and one of the things that happens in that book, which consists of a series of debates with Timothy Williamson, who's also on the program here, is that from the start of the book, which was about 15 years ago, to the final piece in it, I changed my view about the importance of the notion of intuition, which is a notion that's a classical notion that's used especially in connection with a priori issues like mathematics, logic, philosophy, and so on. And I used to be very skeptical of the value of this notion, and I've since become much more interested in it and think it's much more indispensable for explaining our knowledge of the a priori than I used to think.
In what way is intuition important?
Well, it's that, intuition, as I'm using it, is what you might call an intellectual impression of truth. Okay. So just like we have sensory impressions of truth, this kind of visual perception of these flowers and the grass and the river and so on, so that presents you with a certain fact, right? A certain set of facts. Similarly, you can have intuitions that are intellectual in nature. They don't have the same kind of vivid sensory phenomenology, but nevertheless they are presentations of truth. So if I say to you, 2 + 2 is equal to 4, what's your basis for thinking that? You could count things, but which is a kind of fallible way of doing arithmetic, but at the end of it, you end up with the impression that this claim is true. And that's your basis for believing it. So, and this is true for very general things. So for instance, to give an example, suppose you consider 2 circles of unequal radii, and you think, well, they can at most intersect one another at 2 points. And you can run a little thought experiment in which you manipulate the circles, and you see this very, very general proposition, which applies to all circles under all circumstances, is true. And that's a kind of intellectual impression of truth.
Can intuition be dangerous as well? Well, I guess, with maths, maybe it's a safer area because it's more abstract, but for instance with ethical judgments, right, that can seem quite dangerous and a path to kind of justifying prejudice.
You raise a very good question, and just like sensory impressions can mislead, intellectual impressions can mislead. That is just the human condition. And so you don't just go on one little bit of evidence. So there aren't just intellectual impressions of the truth of certain very particular moral scenarios. So people do this kind of thought experiment all the time. Should the trolley experiments and that kind of thing. You have to also see what the underlying principle might be that would yield this verdict in this case, and whether that principle seems correct. And then you have to bring them all into some kind of equilibrium with one another. And so the same process, by the way, that applies to figuring out what the physical world is like also applies to figuring out what the moral world is like, or what the mathematical world is like, and so on.
So the intuition or the intellectual impression can be helpful, but it should be taken with a pinch of salt and a lot of evidence.
It is the evidence. It's just they are the data with which you work. And what you need to do is construct a coherent overall view that reconciles both the individual verdicts that you have along with the general principles that you're inclined to believe. And if hopefully when you do that right, you won't get odious verdicts.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.